The 50 best horror movies of all time, ranked. The horror genre is arguably the hardest to get right. Even tougher than attempting to garner laughs in comedy films, horror filmmakers not only have to perfect the art of pacing and building tension, but they often need to locate something which sets them apart. This could be a variety of things, knowing their audience in relation to the myriad subgenres within horror and really specializing in one, reflecting the neuroses and fears at the heart of the human subject through allegory. Or, perhaps most crucially, having their finger on the pulse of contemporary socio-political issues and commentary, whether timeless or topical. This latter classification is often what makes scary movies truly important. Whether they're seeing slasher, supernatural, psychological, or body horror films, horror audiences are extremely well-informed and often overly critical of genre clichés. Alongside this, culture, morality, politics, and special effects technology are all changing constantly. As such, horror continuously has to reinvent itself, both for its audience and to keep up with the times. Some films have navigated this constant fluctuation extremely well and have become not just scary but utterly important in the process. Whether for their allegorical messages and theories, for their cultural impact, or just for being damn terrifying and visually stunning, these are 55 of not just the best horror movies ever made but the most important, too. 55. The Blob, 1958. The Blob remains the paragon of teen horror B-movies, even if Steve McQueen doesn't pass as a teen, at almost 30. It's a vibrantly colorful movie about hot rod youth and ineffective adults in a small town invaded by an extraterrestrial blob that grows bigger and bigger with everything it absorbs. In all its cheesy glory, The Blob is a blast, but it's also a surprisingly effective allegory for the American fear of communism during the Cold War, or perhaps a critique of consumerist society. Either way, it's a gooey, perfectly paced, schlocky delight. The 1988 remake is actually very good as well. 54. The Conjuring, 2013. Inspired by real-life paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, The Conjuring weaves a spellbinding tale of demonic possession. The Warrens face their most harrowing case, as they confront a malevolent presence that infests a secluded farmhouse. They must unravel the secrets hidden within the haunted walls and protect the innocent from unholy wrath. With each spine-tingling encounter, the film heightens the suspense, immersing viewers in a realm of relentless fear. The movie's plot serves as a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones no one can see. The Conjuring captures the essence of supernatural horror, leaving audiences gripping their seats in anticipation, and jumping out of them from time to time. 53. Train to Busan, 2016. This South Korean masterpiece frenetically unravels a chilling tale of survival. A group of passengers, with a father and son at the center, finds themselves trapped on a speeding train amidst a merciless zombie outbreak. As chaos erupts, the passengers must band together to fight for their lives, navigating treacherous compartments filled with suspense. Train to Busan splendidly utilizes its claustrophobic setting, as each carriage becomes a battleground for survival. With heart-pounding chase sequences, visceral zombie encounters, and heart-wrenching sacrifices, Train to Busan delivers a roller coaster of emotions. 52. Masque of the Red Death, 1964. Of the 8 Edgar Allan Poe adaptations directed by the great Roger Corman, and of the 7 which starred Vincent Price, Masque of the Red Death may be the finest. It's certainly the most cinematic and artistic, using a bold color palette explored in a series of ornate rooms throughout a castle in which a party is being held. Price plays Satanist Prince Prospero, who stages an elaborate shindig while the bubonic plague rages outside his estate. A surprisingly lugubrious film that's contrasted by its incredible production design, Masque of the Red Death remains one of the most underrated horror films of all time. 51. The Wailing, 2016. Set in a small village in South Korea, The Wailing follows the unsettling chain of events that unfold when a mysterious sickness befalls the community, which leads to suspicion and paranoia among all. After the series of gruesome murders, the village descends into chaos, and evil forces tighten their grip. The Wailing expertly crafts an atmosphere of unease and confusion, blurring the lines between reality and the supernatural. It challenges the viewer's perceptions and constantly keeps them on edge. The movie skillfully combines elements of horror, mystery, and psychological thriller, creating an experience that lingers long after the credits roll. 50. Host, 2020. One of the most recent horror masterpieces was also one of the very first films to emerge after the COVID-19 pandemic shut down the world. A right place, right time film, Host is an airtight, efficient little terror that reflected society's collective fears and manifested them into some legitimately perfect jump scares. Host follows a group of friends who hold a séance over Zoom, and with just gallery and speaker view, Rob Savage's low-budget screenlife film manages to be scarier than just about anything this decade. Host is COVID horror at its finest. 49. Gonjiam, The Haunted Asylum, 2018. In Gonjiam, The Haunted Asylum, a YouTube channel run by amateurs sends a team of investigators to the titular asylum in search of excitement and adventure, and the place really does exist in real life. The team plans to conduct a live feed broadcast to check the veracity of the haunting rumors, which turn out to be all too horribly true. From its chilling atmosphere to its expertly crafted scares, Gonjiam, The Haunted Asylum grips viewers from the first haunting note and never lets them go. The found footage concept, while tired by this point in film history, is utilized wonderfully here, with some genuine jump scares and a horrific sense of escalating dread. 48. It, 2017. In the unlikely scenario of the student surpassing the teacher, this recreation of it brought a Stephen King classic, and the freaky clown that came with it, back to life when it premiered in 2017. A new set of outcasts faced the horrifying Pennywise, brought back from his watery grave by Bill Skarsgård. While the shoes of Tim Curry were certainly heavy to fill, Skarsgård's performance as the dancing clown was not to be outmatched. This love letter to the 1990 original was fiendishly frightening, and it single-handedly put the fictitious town of Derry, Maine, back on the map, inspiring many a cosplay in its wake. The massive success of the movie led to it becoming the highest-grossing horror film of all time. 47. The Nightmare, 2015. A horror documentary, and it's actually scary? That's right, The Nightmare is a rarity in the field of horror cinema. Unlike the many documentaries about aliens, Bigfoot, and other creatures that try to creep you out with questionable evidence but lack any real cinematic qualities, The Nightmare is a visually stunning study of something real, namely sleep paralysis. Through highly disturbing dramatic reenactments and moody interviews that are darkly lit and filled with dread, director Rodney Asher, who so expertly deconstructed The Shining in his documentary Room 237, creates an informative and emotional documentary that legitimately functions as a superb horror film. 46. The Witch, 2015. Robert Eggers' The Witch is both a brilliant early American period piece and one of the creepiest movies of the last 10 years. It centers on a Puritan family who have been exiled from their early American settlement for an unnamed religious heresy and settled on a plot of untamed wilderness. Unfortunately for them, it soon becomes clear that witches haunt the woods surrounding their home. The Witch begins with an incredibly spooky opening scene and becomes progressively deranged as it builds towards a truly bone-chilling ending. The entire thing is a fascinating, intellectual look at the ways in which women threatened religious and patriarchal values and how there is no way to start anew in America, even 400 years ago. If you want horror blended with history, The Witch should be of special appeal to you. 45. The Ring, 1998. The Ring, also known as Ringu, is a Japanese supernatural horror movie based on the novel by Koji Suzuki. Not to be confused with the excellent 2002 remake starring Naomi Watts, this film starred Nanako Matsushima, Miki Nakatani, and Hiroyuki Sanada and almost single-handedly kickstarted the American craze of remaking J-horror films. The Ring, and, technically, its remakes, are unique in that they inspired fear long before viewers sat down to watch thanks to clever viral marketing. The concept was simple: watch this cursed film, and, in doing so, become cursed yourself. Not just cursed, in fact, but doomed to die within the week. This begged the question: would watching this haunted VHS, even vicariously, lead to the death of its audience? Thankfully, the answer was a resounding no. Still, it helped introduce a whole new generation to horror and was an iconic way to mark the turn of the century and the many technological changes humanity endured. 44. Antichrist, 2009. Lars von Trier has been through more phases than a teenager, but it was his later Depression trilogy that brought out the infamous director's most stylized and haunting work. Antichrist is a visually gorgeous slow burn with powerhouse performances from its only 2 stars, Willem Dafoe and Charlotte Gainsbourg. They play a therapist and his wife who are mourning the loss of their young child. Deciding to get away from it all at a cabin in the woods, never a good choice in horror, the therapist makes the mistake of attempting to heal his wife. But there is something very dark lurking within that cabin, and maybe within her. Not for the squeamish, Antichrist's morbid atmosphere builds to a crescendo of visceral violence that's as shocking as anything seen in great art house cinema. 43. Re-Animator, 1985. The great Stuart Gordon spent his career trying to adapt H.P. Lovecraft's cosmic horror stories for the big screen, and succeeded the most with his laugh-out-loud, disgusting, over-the-top masterpiece, Re-Animator. Starring Jeffrey Combs at his all-time manic best as Herbert West, this gory take on the mad scientist film finds the good doctor experimenting on resurrecting the dead, with horrific and hilarious results. Check out the kooky sequel, Bride of Re-Animator, 2. 42. Evil Dead 2, 1987. While the original Evil Dead is a groundbreaking classic, it's Evil Dead 2 that remains the best film of the franchise, and is also the best introduction to it. Half reboot, half sequel, Sam Raimi's follow-up recounts the events that led to Ash being trapped in a creepy cabin, surrounded by demonic spirits. Bruce Campbell's unhinged performance is a delight, and he masters the slapstick horror of it all before the franchise got a bit too silly with Army of Darkness. Still super cool and a blast to this day, Evil Dead 2 is one of the greatest films to watch with friends. 41. Cat People, 1942. In many ways the progenitor of feminist horror cinema, the ways in which Cat People addresses female desire and social structures seems shocking for its early 1940s settings. Featuring a sublime performance from the downright feline Simone Simon, the film follows a recently married woman who begins to believe that she's inherited a peculiar trait. She thinks she'll turn into a Black Panther if she's turned on. It's a premise that could be played for laughs or just pure cheesy ridiculousness, and yet, like nearly every horror film from producer Val Lewton, it's deadly serious and very sophisticated. Master craftsman Jacques Tourneur directs his heart out, implementing film noir qualities and finding magical ways to evoke sensuality, arousal, and fear. While it's hardly a scary film, it has a vibe all its own. 40. Pulse, 2001. Kiyoshi Kurosawa, no relation, is one of the best yet most underrated filmmakers of our time, and in the 90s and early 2000s, he had a string of utter masterpieces, back to back. Here, Charisma, Bright Future, and perhaps above all, Pulse, were some of the most original and intellectual Japanese films of the period, though they often get overlooked. Pulse may be Kurosawa's best outright horror film, a deeply pessimistic study of loneliness and alienation in the technological world. Set at the dawn of this new millennium, Pulse follows a disconnected set of people whose paths cross due to a series of disappearances and suicides. The internet is literally haunted in this film, and the result is apocalyptic. A truly brooding feature, Pulse remains one of the best and spookiest critiques of the post-digital era. Avoid the American remake at all costs. 39. Get Out, 2017. There's not much that hasn't already been said about this Blumhouse classic. An easy Oscar contender, Get Out was a crash course in low-budget movie making, having been filmed over the course of 23 days with a measly $5 million budget. That being said, audiences didn't seem to mind. In fact, it earned nearly $250 million worldwide. As a first-time director, Jordan Peele, who also served as writer and producer on the film, was the first African American in those roles to earn more than $100,000 in a debut film. Not only that, he also picked up the 2018 Oscar for Best Original Screenplay in the process. What makes this a fantastic atmospheric horror movie is the general sense of unease throughout. Meeting the parents is always hard, but this is quite possibly the worst outcome imaginable. Inspired by films like Rosemary's Baby and The Stepford Wives, its ability to socially critique and inspire conversations about race relations will forever cement its status as a must-see film. 38. Let the Right One In, 2008. Bullies, beware. Let the Right One In is a Swedish horror film that reinvigorated the tired vampire genre upon its release in 2008. In it, a bullied young boy befriends a strange girl who shares with him her secret, one that just might have something to do with a murdered townsfolk or two. Will he become her Renfield as a result? This film is based on the 2004 novel by Jon Ajvide Lindqvist, who also served as the sole screenwriter for the film. Even with, or perhaps because of, the language barrier, this movie is absolutely unsettling. Its focus on the dark side of humanity, as told through mere children, is what makes this film truly terrifying to watch. 37. Häxan, 1922. A truly special silent film unlike any other, Häxan feels like a secret home movie discovered from a group of ancient witches and devil worshippers. As such, it's an anomaly among silent cinema, and feels actually authentic and creepy. The film is a quasi-documentary using the Malleus Maleficarum, the handbook used by inquisitors to detect and try witches, as its North Star. It's an anthology of sorts, dramatizing the use of witchcraft and satanic activity throughout Western history. In 1968, capitalizing on the counterculture, the Swedish silent film was re-edited with a captivating voiceover narration from the one and only William Burroughs, Naked Lunch, Junkie, and released as Häxan, Witchcraft Through the Ages. It's a very different film, and also an excellent one, though it lacks the mystery of the original masterpiece. 36. 28 Days Later, 2002. The zombie genre had somewhat dried up by the turn of the 21st century, but 28 Days Later resurrected it from the dead, leading to a whole new zombie craze with films like Shaun of the Dead and series like The Walking Dead. The legendary Danny Boyle film emptied out London to create a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and used state-of-the-art digital cameras to capture every minute detail, resulting in a gorgeously washed-out look that gets frenetic and intimate when it wants to. Cillian Murphy stars as a man who wakes up in a hospital bed, having slept through the apocalypse. A viral outbreak has infected people with almost literal rage, and thus the fast zombie was born. With an incredible soundtrack, a heartbreaking performance from Brendan Gleeson, and great work from Murphy, Naomi Harris, and Christopher Eccleston, 28 Days Later is a gritty, realistic, and emotional classic. 35. Jaws, 1975. This Steven Spielberg classic inspired a whole generation of viewers out of the water and into the theater. While the production of Jaws was riddled with mechanical failures of its iconic shark, it still managed to take a bite out of the box office and even nabbed 3 Oscars. With cutting-edge cinematography and an iconic original score by John Williams, this film put the audience in the character's perspective, proving once and for all that sometimes what an audience can't see is far worse than anything a character can. While it's debatable whether Jaws is an outright horror film or not, it has undeniably frightened millions of people since its iconic release. The film almost single-handedly created the shark movie, leading to countless crude copycats, and arguably worse sequels. 34. Possession, 1981. Possession is a weird film, and some people may be confused by it while others may be extremely disturbed. But one thing is for certain, Isabella Gianni's performance is perhaps the best in all horror cinema. She's a madwoman here, utterly unhinged and completely vulnerable, oscillating from intimidating eroticism to aggressively violent insanity. Andrei Zulawski's 1981 film feels like a Cold War thriller and a dark romance mixed together and then blasted with rays of grotesque horror. Sam Neill suspects that his wife, Ajani, is cheating on him, and through some sleuthing, discovers that she has entered into a destructive sexual relationship with some kind of disgusting monster. Politically allegorical, deeply psychological, and visually sickening, Possession is a bonkers mess of cinematic brilliance. 33. Dead of Night, 1945. One of the earliest and best anthology films, the chilling British horror movie Dead of Night mastered the medium long before franchises like V/H/S. Dead of Night has a tight and brilliant framing device featuring a group of people at a country cottage in England exchanging stories and testing the supposed psychic abilities of one of their own. The stories will ultimately overlap in a surprising and haunting ending, but they are individually masterful, featuring dark comedy and some spine-tingling imagery that has gone on to influence British horror ever since. Arguably the first horror film to premiere after England banned the genre during wartime, Dead of Night feels like a direct result of the collective traumas endured by the British during World War II. With evil puppets, murderous adulterers, Christmas-time bloodshed, and wandering ghosts, the film seems to foreshadow European horror of the 20th century and many of the tropes that have now become obligatory for the genre. 32. Black Christmas, 1974. There's a strong argument that Black Christmas was the first real modern slasher film, predating Halloween by 4 years and solidifying the template that would be, literally, used to death in horror cinema. A group of young people, mostly women, are murdered one by one until the final girl is forced to confront the killer. Black Christmas stands out by not only being one of the first, but by having an incredible cast: Olivia Hussey, Keir Dullea, Margot Kidder, Andrea Martin, Lynn Griffin, John Saxon, by utilizing the neon haze of Christmastime before countless other horror films would, and by featuring excellent direction from Bob Clark, who would make a very different holiday classic with the timeless A Christmas Story. The Canadian slasher film keeps you guessing from the start as a sorority house becomes plagued by a hidden murderer. Threatening phone calls, someone possibly living in the attic, and a wonderfully off-kilter Keir Dullea, 2001, A Space Odyssey, performance seals the deal here. The iconic telephone scene where the operator and police try to trace a call remains one of the most suspenseful of all time. 31. Freaks, 1932. While Dracula may remain his most famous film, the great Todd Browning directed another, much more politically incorrect, uncomfortable, and disturbing film the year after his Bela Lugosi classic, Freaks. It's a difficult film to discuss, not just because of the possibly exploitative way in which it depicts different people, but because of the discrimination inflicted upon many members of its cast. Browning wanted the film, about a jealous and ultimately violent love affair among sideshow performers, to be as authentic as possible, so he and his casting director had a lengthy process of finding the right cast. They filled the film with wonderfully unique carnival professionals, but the heads of MGM were so shocked by their appearances that they kept the actors out of the studio and relegated them to a flimsy tent erected away from the normal employees. The casting worked, and even though Freaks humanized these individuals, who mostly gave phenomenal, unforgettable performances, the film disturbed so many audience members that viewers protested the film. One woman almost sued MGM, ridiculously claiming that Freaks caused her to have a miscarriage. Years later, the film would find a cult audience through late-night showing on TV and became reappraised as one of the greatest films ever made. It's a nightmarish, Boschian vision of the rejected and ostracized, and it reminds us that we are all one of them. 30. The Descent, 2005. This instant classic follows 6 friends who reunite after a recent tragedy involving the protagonist's family. As she is still healing and full of grief, the group of young women decides to take a trip to the remote western Appalachians and go cave diving. The gang has intentions of a fun bonding trip, but their descent into the murky depths of the earth takes a claustrophobic and terrifying turn when confronted with bloodthirsty creatures. It's a thrill to watch strong female characters who are simultaneously messy and selfish, as we all can be, and the allegorical structure of the film lends itself to a bevy of interpretations. The film is a literal descent into the psyches of 21st century liberation and feminist politics, with various neuroses and cultural issues manifesting themselves quite literally in gruesome, gory scenes. Plus, The Descent has a lovely fake-out ending for the books that still chills us years later. 29. Jacob's Ladder, 1990. Though the plot twist is probably spoiled for everyone by now, Jacob's Ladder is so incredible on its own that it succeeds without the surprise. Tim Robbins is arguably at his finest here as a Vietnam veteran who is either suffering from extreme PTSD, or is actually being haunted, or hunted, by truly demonic forces. Adrian Lyne's paranoid, ambiguous direction creates an overwhelming sense of dread. Hiding terrifying things in the frame and eventually disturbing is with some of the most unsettling imagery in modern horror. 28. The Wicker Man, 1973. The best of a fascinating wave of British folk horror films, The Wicker Man isn't exactly scary or menacing, but that's actually part of its unique appeal. It's a sunny, bright movie that reminds us of all the terrifying ideologies, beliefs, and violence that are hidden in plain sight in our very own communities. It's a precursor to Midsommar, another excellent horror movie, as well as all the scary movies which tap into our collective fear of the other. The other goes both ways in The Wicker Man. There is the laconic Sergeant Neil Howie, who arrives at a small island populated mostly by women. He's looking for a vanished young girl but is an obvious outsider in this mysterious place. His conservative Christian faith and stern patriarchal leanings are offended by the Celtic paganism and feminism of this community, and each party feels threatened by the other. His investigation only leads him deeper into the dark truth of the island. An odd, dreamy movie with one of the great endings in horror, The Wicker Man is a classic with some deep cultural meaning. 27. The Blair Witch Project, 1999. Although Cannibal Holocaust is considered to be the first found-footage film, The Blair Witch Project repopularized the subgenre in 1999 and mastered it at the same time, for better or worse. At the time of its release, the film about a group of student filmmakers, who venture into the mysterious Black Hills to investigate an urban legend, left audiences terrified. Using largely inexperienced actors, the film expertly used its 35-page script to improvise much of the dialogue, adding to the feel of a real home movie. The critical and commercial success of the film was unprecedented, grossing $250 million from a barely $400,000 budget and reinvigorating the horror genre for the looming 21st century. While it can be thanked for some of the best found-footage horror and some of the worst, The Blair Witch Project remains the most important. 26. Hellraiser, 1987. Clive Barker's masterpiece, Hellraiser, has stood the test of time and, if anything, has only become more revered as the years pass. Demonically inventive, with some of the greatest creature design in film history, Hellraiser follows a genuinely nasty family and an ancient puzzle box. The Rubik's Cube-like box summons the Cenobites, creatures from other dimensions that are really into BDSM. Pain and pleasure is mixed in their world, and they unleash literal hell on everything they come into contact with. No matter how many bad sequels or divisive remakes, the original Hellraiser remains a legitimately nasty classic. 25. Scream, 1996. Scream brought the meta subgenre of cinema to the forefront near the turn of the century and millennium. Of course, the original film in a franchise is often the best one, especially in this case. Nevertheless, the franchise prevailed, with the fifth and latest installment so successful that even Scream 6 has done incredibly well. Wes Craven's first film, meanwhile, is rightfully considered a classic that set the stage for meta-commentary films and the almost Brechtian ironic distanciation that would take hold of cinema in the 90s, centered on the fictional town of Woodsboro. The story follows a high school becoming increasingly tormented by a mysterious ghost-face killer quietly making his own movie with each slaying. As the original film's tagline goes, someone has taken their love of scary movies one step too far. It set the stage for a brilliant sequel and a surprisingly strong franchise and delivered some of the similar shocks that Psycho did 3 decades prior with the film's willingness to kill major characters and play with the audience's expectations. 24. Vampyr, 1932. Carl Theodor Dreyer directed a handful of the best films of all time, and his stern but spiritual style and consistent meditations upon faith has made him one of the best transcendental directors of all time. His early classic, Vampyr, is an interesting exception to his filmography, which includes the silent masterpiece The Passion of Joan of Arc and another perfect religious film, Ordette, but also features many of his themes. After all, horror films are often as close as movies get to addressing outright spiritual and supernatural things with any mainstream appeal. Released a year after Dracula, the brilliant Danish film, with an international flair, is arguably an even better vampire tale. Vampyr has ghostly, timeless imagery that is impossible to forget, from its washed-out look in general to specific sequences like the walking shadows and flour mill scenes. The film follows a traveler's stay at an inn which is interrupted by strange apparitions, a murder, and the demonic world. 23. A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. The great Wes Craven had a stroke of genius with A Nightmare on Elm Street, introducing the dream world to typical slasher cinema. This allowed for one of the most creative horror franchises, as the only limitation to the horror was someone's imagination and budget. Freddy Krueger, Robert Englund, became a bit of a punk throughout the years, but in the original film, he's a genuinely haunting and evil force, a former child killer whose presence infiltrates the world through dreams. Featuring some outstanding practical effects, a great young cast, including Johnny Depp, inventive death scenes, and a disturbing ending, A Nightmare on Elm Street is hailed as a classic for good reason. 22. Videodrome, 1983. David Cronenberg's filmography is brimming with horror, but he's not exactly a horror filmmaker. He's made a few direct horror films, Rabid, Shivers, but in general, he makes unclassifiable cinema with utterly horrific visuals. He's the master of body horror, even if his films often lean more towards sci-fi, drama, or thriller masterpieces, Naked Lunch, Existence, Crash, Scanners, A History of Violence, etc. Videodrome is probably his darkest and most disturbing, though, at least until last year's Crimes of the Future, but Videodrome is indisputably better. The film follows a sleazy TV executive who stumbles upon an illegal television channel depicting intense BDSM, torture, and other menacing acts. He tries to acquire the signal and air it on his own network, but the signal is seemingly affecting the brains of people who watch it, leading to a series of horrifying hallucinations. Starring James Woods in his best performance alongside the great Deborah Harry, of the band Blondie, Videodrome is a creepy commentary on the media, violence, and technology, and feels like a direct manifestation of Marshall McLuhan's writing. It's brilliant, sick, visually stunning, and endlessly thought-provoking. 21. Peeping Tom, 1960. Among cinephiles, there has been a debate for nearly 6 decades about which is the better film and most important film, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho or Powell Pressburger's Peeping Tom. Both films were released in 1960, but Psycho caught on, and Peeping Tom didn't, for whatever reason. It was probably the lurid nature of the shower scene and the flushing toilet in Psycho. But also the fact that Peeping Tom intentionally implicates the audience by aligning their perspective with that of the killer. The film is one of the first great meta-commentaries on media consumption and our collective addiction to violence, following a cinematographer who literally kills with his camera, after attaching a blade to it, so that he can film his victims. A real anomaly in Powell Pressburger's filmography together, which included masterworks like The Red Shoes and Black Narcissus, Peeping Tom nonetheless retained the vibrant and sensational color palettes of their aesthetic, making this early prototype for slasher horror all the more disturbing by how gorgeous it is. 20. Don't Look Now, 1973. Nicholas Regg's Don't Look Now was one of a number of 1970s horror films that helped to give the genre a highbrow sheen. Rather than play into pulpy tropes or lean into shock value, Don't Look Now's approach to scaring audiences is restrained, calculated, and yet still deeply unsettling. Regg's characteristically dreamlike editing and photography is ever present here and used to exciting effect. We follow a married couple who have relocated to Venice after losing their daughter in an accident. The two seem to catch flashes of their daughter around the city, but things aren't quite what they seem. It's a masterful study of grief and one of the scariest movies of the 70s, but also a surprisingly honest look at marriage and a very erotic film considering its nature. As such, it almost studies the relationship between sex and violence that birthed a new type of horror cinema in 1960 with Psycho and Peeping Tom. 19. Eyes Without a Face, 1960. While horror films from France really didn't become prolific until the terrifying, or just disgusting, new French extremity movement of the 2000s, the French did produce 2 of the greatest horror films of all time between 1955 and 1960, including Clouzot's Les Diaboliques and Georges Franju's masterpiece, Eyes Without a Face, Les Yeux Sans Visage. The eerily poetic film transforms the mad scientist trope into something more beautiful, dreamlike, and melancholic, as a famous doctor attempts to reconstruct his daughter's face after a horrible accident. While she is believed dead, the doctor sneakily kidnaps women and unsuccessfully attempts to graft their face onto his daughter's. It's at times graphically disturbing, harkening back to Franju's traumatizing short documentary about slaughterhouses, Blood of the Beasts, while also hazily segueing into pure cinematic poetry. There's something infinitely ethereal about this ghostly film about identity, obsession, and guilt that has made Eyes Without a Face one of the most hypnotic and memorable horror films ever made. 18. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, 1986. Some horror films are so intense that they simply become unwatchable, at least to most people. For those who can stomach Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, they'll be rewarded with one of the most unflinching, authentic portrayals of evil and psychosis in film history, an underrated serial killer film. At least by today's standards, John McNaughton's movie studies the arbitrary murders committed by Henry and his very close friend Otis. Michael Rooker gives one of the greatest performances of all time as the titular serial killer, an enigmatic figure that McNaughton and Rooker refuse to compromise on. The violence is appalling and never used for entertainment, and the notorious videotape scene will fuel nightmares for many. 17. Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. Of the several masterful Universal monster movies, The Invisible Man, The Wolf Man, Dracula, House of Frankenstein, and yes, even the original Frankenstein, it is The Bride of Frankenstein, which perhaps stands taller than the rest. It's a weirder, sadder, more ambitious, and funnier film than almost any of the others, even incorporating a wonderful dramatized scene with original Frankenstein author Mary Shelley in its introduction to humorously state its major themes of ethics, industrialization, and atheism. The film begins directly after the events of Frankenstein, continuing from its rather rushed ending and elaborating upon the film to the extent that it retroactively makes it better. Elsa Lanchester is total perfection as the titular bride, giving a sophisticated yet visceral and cat-like performance opposite Boris Karloff's legendary Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein is nursed back to health by his fiancée and is driven to continue his experiments, hoping that a mate for the monster would solve things, reflecting his own relationship. Of course, everything ends in tears yet again, but here the monster is humanized further to a heartbreaking degree, and the idea of humanity replacing God is fleshed out to apocalyptic proportions. 16. Nosferatu, 1922. When it comes to the greatest and most influential horror films, one has to pay homage to the original Nosferatu, the vampire movie, to end all vampire movies. Though we'll soon be getting a Robert Eggers-led remake of the same name, F.W. Murnau's silent version remains an early pinnacle of the genre. While Nosferatu is more than 100 years old and obviously dated. As a result, its expressionistic filmmaking and imaginative photography retain its spot as one of the greatest horror films ever made. Somehow, this early, unofficial adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which finds a vampire using a real estate agent as a way to migrate to a more populated area, where he stalks the man's partner, is actually enhanced by being silent, the gloomy, stilted filmmaking its fright factor and contributes to a particularly chilling atmosphere. Max Schreck gives a legendary performance as the titular vampire that is arguably scarier than any other rendition of a vampire, outside perhaps Reggie Nalder in Salem's Lot. Don't believe us? Try watching it alone in a dark and empty house. You'll be running from your own shadow. 15. Suspiria, 1977. Suspiria is one of the most unique and ingenious horror films ever made and arguably Dario Argento's best giallo film. It follows an American ballet student, Susie Banyan, Jessica Harper, who transfers to a prestigious dance academy in Germany with her career hopes held high before eventually discovering that the academy is actually headed by a murderous coven of witches. With an iconic 70s film score, and repetitively hypnagogic music from Goblin blasting over scenes that largely shy away from the typical single-person murder mystery plot, Suspiria ventured into the brightly colored supernatural. The film brilliantly builds tension and serves as one of the most nauseatingly scary films of all time, with a murder scene so brutal. 8 minutes were cut out of the American version in order for it to pass as an R-rated film. Suspiria directly influenced the Halloween films, which, of course, influenced the reinvention of the slasher horror subgenre. Argento's use of style over substance has inspired countless horror filmmakers since. 14. Rosemary's Baby, 1968. No list of this kind would be complete without the legendary Rosemary's Baby. It is an enduring classic of the horror genre and one of the most paranoia-inducing films ever made, though Polanski's other horror masterpieces, Repulsion and especially The Tenant, could easily be included here. A young couple moves into a beautiful new apartment, they make friends with their neighbors, and after some time, they conceive their first child. But what should be a happy series of events becomes a waking nightmare. If satanic cults make your skin crawl, Rosemary's Baby is the horror film for you. It was a perfect cinematic alternative to the hippie movement and the peace and love which was broadcast across media. Rosemary's Baby represented the awfulness that was brewing just beneath the surface, waiting to be born. 13. Poltergeist, 1982. Poltergeist explores common horror genre anxieties such as the supernatural, clowns, dysfunctional technology, and the loss of family with great visuals and a Spielbergian sense of wonder. Another horror critique of the suburbs, the film can be seen as an allegory for the most extreme and capitalistic form of bringing the nuclear family back to the suburbs, first in the 1950s, then in the 1980s. In the age of Reaganism without any regard for the working class or people of color who get trampled upon along the way. After all, their house was haunted because the property was knowingly built over a cemetery of indigenous peoples. The real estate deal was made without a single regard for the dead in order to make a quick buck. The consequences were dire. Their daughter was held hostage by the ghosts of the dead laying under the house. Their son was almost eaten by a tree come alive, assaulted by a toy clown, and their pool was overflowed by the coffins upon which the house was constructed. For a family film rated PG, Poltergeist trumps almost every R-rated horror film ever made and is a masterful example of creating scares without excessive violence or gore. 12. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1978. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a unique creation in horror history. The film exists in nearly every decade since its iconic inception in the 1950s, but what's most interesting is how each version of the classic touches upon important socio-political themes surrounding its release date. The original commented on communism and the McCarthy witch hunts. The 70s version was an allegory for Watergate and mistrust of government. Abel Ferrara's brilliant Body Snatchers was a commentary on both the American military and AIDS. The Nicole Kidman starring The Invasion from 2007 took on the Iraq War and global terrorism. A new version is even being developed, albeit slowly. The 1978 iteration directed by Philip Kaufman may be the best, though, as it combines exceptional acting, striking visuals, disgusting gore, and a brilliantly disturbing ending which is sure to haunt viewers long after the film is over. Its political and cultural subtext may have made it one of the best horror films of the 70s, but its style, bleakness, and conclusion cement it as one of the most important scary movies ever made. 11. Hereditary, 2018. With Hereditary, Ari Aster instantly made a name for himself in the vast annals of the horror film archives, making a movie about possession that separated itself from the countless Exorcist knockoffs and a haunting film about the destruction of a suburban family, a frequent horror theme. With the help of Toni Collette's Oscar-worthy performance, he depicts a family slowly unraveling as a result of loss, grief, anger, and supernatural intervention. With a plethora of intense, surprising, and disturbing scenes, Hereditary could arguably be considered one of the most psychologically scarring films of the genre. While it may have been overhyped, there is no doubt that it's partly responsible for the contemporary new wave in elevated horror, which sees the genre creating some of the most exciting, unique pieces in all cinema. It will leave you haunted by the grotesque images it implants into your mind. 10. Carnival of Souls, 1962. Carnival of Souls follows a woman experiencing a mental breakdown after a car accident. She tries to settle down in a new town but is haunted by dark figures and intimidated by aggressive men. The film is important for myriad reasons. It was one of the very first horror films to be from a woman's perspective and follow a female protagonist, a woman who operates resolutely against social norms and is constantly pushing back against the male gaze which surrounds her. It is also one of the first purely independent mainstream movies, and not just in the horror genre, filmed for just $33,000 by Harold Herc Harvey, who had mainly done educational and industrial short films on commission. Carnival of Souls is almost a DIY art film, but one influenced by and devoted to classic horror. Everything works together perfectly: the creepy organ music score, the high-contrast black and white visuals, the use of Aeroflex cameras to film motion, the minimalist but haunting makeup, to create a hallucinatory nightmare that would go on to inspire George Romero, David Lynch, and countless low-budget horror filmmakers. 9. Halloween, 1978. While zombie films had been around for multiple decades prior to George A. Romero, it really wasn't until Night of the Living Dead that they had some sort of solidified cinematic canon. Once his grainy, gritty masterpiece was released, everyone automatically associated zombies with their depiction here. Romero manages to use his limitations beneficially, turning poorly lit black and white cinematography into high art. Surprisingly effective even to this day, Night of the Living Dead is a dark glimpse at the zombie apocalypse and what happens when a group of people try to tough it out. Dwayne Jones is phenomenal as the lead, in a performance that deserves just as much credit as Sidney Poitier's 1960s films for breaking down racial barriers in film. Like all of Romero's zombie movies, it's more a meditation on humanity's evils than the zombies, and while it's arguably not as entertaining and interesting as its first sequel, Dawn of the Dead, it's probably more iconic. 8. Night of the Living Dead, 1968. While zombie films had been around for multiple decades prior to George A. Romero, it really wasn't until Night of the Living Dead that they had some sort of solidified cinematic canon. Once his grainy, gritty masterpiece was released, everyone automatically associated zombies with their depiction here. Romero manages to use his limitations beneficially, turning poorly lit black and white cinematography into high art. Surprisingly effective even to this day, Night of the Living Dead is a dark glimpse at the zombie apocalypse and what happens when a group of people try to tough it out. Dwayne Jones is phenomenal as the lead, in a performance that deserves just as much credit as Sidney Poitier's 1960s films for breaking down racial barriers in film. Like all of Romero's zombie movies, it's more a meditation on humanity's evils than the zombies, and while it's arguably not as entertaining and interesting as its first sequel, Dawn of the Dead, it's probably more iconic. 7. Psycho, 1960. The American slasher genre would not exist without Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's film about a man's, Anthony Perkins, horrifying obsession with his mother and the Freudian perils of parents prohibiting their children from being autonomous adults for fear of having empty nest syndrome. The film is infamous for its surprising nihilism, its decision to quit following the main star halfway through the film, and its disturbing sense of unease, which was a catalyst for a whole new wave of atmospheric horror, lest we forget the famous shower scene, which featured the first-person stabbing angle edited between lurid sexual cinematography that would become a staple in great giallo horror movies and the later slasher films of the 1980s. Initially heavily censored because of its violence and commentary about gender and sexuality, Psycho is Hitchcock's purest distillation of tension and sexuality, and birthed a new age in horror. 6. The Thing, 1982. When it comes to horror, few names loom as large in the public eye as John Carpenter. He is, without a doubt, a master of horror, and The Thing is one of his highest achievements. Set in a remote research station in Antarctica, the film is both a kind of creature feature and a spiritual successor to Ridley Scott's Alien. Just swap the Nostromo spaceship for a base in the coldest place on Earth, which may as well be outer space considering how far from civilization it is. When a mutating assimilatory organism makes its way into the station, all hell breaks loose. It can perfectly imitate other life forms, absorb just about anything, and if left to roam free, it could potentially swallow up all life on Earth. With the odds stacked against him, R.J. McCready, Kurt Russell, must face off against this unnamed thing. Be ready for some palpable tension. 5. Dawn of the Dead, 1978. It's certainly true that Night of the Living Dead is one of the best horror films of all time, one which launched the popular version of zombies into the cultural zeitgeist. That film's stark black and white photography, intuitive racial politics, haunting imagery, and nihilistic ending all make it a masterpiece. However, it could be said that Dawn of the Dead is not just a superior film but a scarier and more important one. Night of the Living Dead walked so that Dawn of the Dead could run, slowly. George Romero's sequel finds the filmmaker truly tapping into the metaphorical potential of the zombie for the first time, something he'd do in several subsequent films. Dawn of the Dead is almost a Marxist polemic, pitting the bourgeois zombies, wandering a shopping plaza, dazed consumers addicted to capitalism, cursed to shop for eternity, against the proletariat heroes, a ragtag group including the incredible Ken Foree, in the claustrophobic capitalist utopia of a mall. While the black and white of Night of the Living Dead was striking, the color in Dawn of the Dead is brilliantly vibrant, the screen popping with the colorful brightness of brands and fluorescence, and the blood a memorable, perfect red. Dawn of the Dead is important for not just allegorizing the zombie, but for helping popularize horror comedy, injecting a lot of the film with a gory humor that has gone on to influence decades of horror comedy. The gore, the acting, the editing, the suspense, and the extremely intense heart-pounding ending make Dawn of the Dead essential to horror and cinema itself. 4. The Shining, 1980. Stanley Kubrick brilliantly adapted Stephen King's eponymous novel with The Shining, a film about a writer's descent into madness at a haunted hotel during its off-season. The intensity of Jack Torrance's, Jack Nicholson, isolation increases in every subsequent frame of the film, which is endlessly referenced in popular culture. Fans still quote the enduring lines, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy," and "Red Rum." The film is an extreme case of family dysfunction amidst an unhealthy work-life balance, and the stressors society and patriarchy impose upon the working class, with a hint of cabin fever and demonic haunting thrown in. The film's artistry is legendary, with its iconic visuals and terrifying sequences forever lodged into viewers' minds. Like several of the important films here, The Shining was chosen to be preserved in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. 3. Alien, 1979. Ridley Scott's Alien isn't your average horror film, due to its minimalism, its science fiction overtones, and the fact that it takes place entirely in space. One might even consider it a sci-fi movie more than it is a horror film. However, that doesn't take away from the overwhelming sense of dread throughout its 117-minute runtime. It is a masterclass in slowly building suspense, delivering great jump scares, and creating gross-out body horror. From its opening scene of isolated space travel, a piercing silence builds a palpable sense of tension. It's clear that the government-sanctioned mining crew gets more than they bargained for when they discover the perfect killing machine in the terrifying xenomorph. It's not only an allegory for the US government's careless treatment of its military troops abroad, but also one for assault, this time in the form of females assaulting men as payback for the overabundance of male-on-female assault scenes in horror before the film's release. In the case of the facehugger, according to screenwriter Dan O'Bannon, the creature builds upon the cisgender male's fear. Alien is a bare-bones, metaphorical masterpiece. 2. The Exorcist, 1973. The Exorcist is the prototype for countless, lesser possession films that would come out after its 1973 release. A film about a 12-year-old girl named Regan, Linda Blair, a sweet child who becomes possessed after an elderly priest unwittingly releases a demon, might have seemed like typical B-movie fodder, but the movie proved how critically acclaimed and commercially successful well-done horror can be. At the time, audiences were both repulsed and inexplicably drawn to the film, as is often the case with scary movies, which may be reflective of our collective fixation with the horror genre. With The Exorcist, however, reactions were more extreme than most cinemas had seen at the time, bringing horror cinema full circle with freaks, viewers puked and fainted, and even one woman in New York reportedly miscarried during a screening, per The Sun. These severe audience reactions prompted protests, which led to even more interest, and theaters provided exorcist-themed barf bags and hired ambulances outside their doors in case any further health issues arose among their audiences. Nobody had seen anything like it at the time, and while special effects and narrative arts have progressed over the past 50 years, for many people, The Exorcist is still the scariest movie they've seen. The film remained the highest-grossing R-rated horror film until 2017's It, in large part due to its ability to shock and disgust while still being somehow artistic. Its artistry and popularity helped redefine the modern horror film as we know it. 1. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an exploration of the bizarre macabre, using the predatory murders of a group of 70s kids as a launching point for something truly important and terrifying. Taking after the themes of Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left in 1972, the film explores the most extreme version of American freedom and the essence of cult, released 5 years after the Manson murders in 1969 and 1 year before the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. Hooper's perversion of the nuclear family echoed both the popularity of cults among the American people at home and the senseless, brutal violence of imperialistic endeavors abroad, the idea of democratizing or forcing one's beliefs upon other people to the point of destruction. If the cult is the terrifying ultimate manifestation of freedom of expression, then imperialism abroad is its antithesis. It's no coincidence that Hooper chooses hippies, who were both opponents of the Vietnam War and a large portion of the makeup of the extended Manson family, as his victims, highlighting the often hypocritical nature of both the American way and New Age individualism. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the most shocking, violent, artistic, and thought-provoking horror films of all time, an American masterpiece that led to numerous sequels and reboots.